Today is June 21st, 2011, and I'm in the home of Jean Humphrey. Jean, may I have permission to record your voice in your picture today?
Yes, you have that permission.
Jean, you were Iowa Teacher of the Year in 1957, and you were National Teacher of the Year in 1958. But before we get to those honors that you received, tell me your hometown and where you had your teacher training.
I grew up in Fairfax, Iowa, which is right near Cedar Rapids. And I went to grade school in Fairfax, but went to high school at Roosevelt High School in Cedar Rapids. And from there, I went to Cornell College after I graduated from high school. And part of the reason I went to Cornell College was I went to Methodist camp, and I got to know the president's wife from Cornell College, and she suggested that I might like to go there. And so I did, and I received my teacher training at Cornell. Did my student teaching in Cedar Rapids and Mount Vernon. And after graduation, I went to Newton, Iowa. And I taught second grade there for 2 years. But decided I wanted to change, and so I came to Ames. And an interesting thing of how I was interviewed for coming to Ames, different than it is now, because the superintendent of schools and the person who was the head of elementary ed came to Newton and observed me in the classroom, which they don't do now.
Was that unnerving? Did it seem strange to have someone come in, or was that a practice of the time?
I don't know if that was unusual or not, but anyhow, it was a little nerve-wracking because I'd been teaching for 2 years. But then I came to Ames.
And can you give me a year? When did you come to Ames for the first time to teach?
Came to Ames in '53.
Mm-hmm.
And my first teaching experience was at the old Welch School. Welch Junior High also had an elementary section.
And Old Welch doesn't exist anymore.
Old Welch doesn't exist.
It was between Sheldon and South Highland. But
That's true.
it covered almost an entire city block.
It almost took the whole block.
Yes.
And I was, the only opening they had for second grade was in the basement of the old Welch School. And the junior high children were upstairs.
Teaching in a basement.
I was teaching in a basement.
I
It
guess-
wasn't ideal.
I guess that's about starting on the ground level, so to speak.
That's right. That's right.
Now, in the basement, I went to middle school there, and I remember there might have been old home economics rooms.
There was an home economics for the junior high right next door to my room. And of course that was an old room, no place to wash hands after finger painting. You can imagine a bunch of little finger painters going down the hall to the bathroom, having a lot of fun.
So that second grade room in Old Welch Junior High probably didn't have a lot of windows because it was down low.
Yeah, they were low windows.
And roughly how many children did you have there?
Probably at that time around 24, I would guess. But it was a small room.
And what was a satisfying memory that you have from teaching second grade in that building?
That building?
Or was it all pretty hard work?
Well, had a lot of neat kids. One important thing is that I play the piano, and so the parents got together and bought a piano to put into that small room. And so that was kind of a highlight for everybody.
I'm going to pick up on that thought, and we're going to hold it and put it forward. But just so you know, I want to talk about your relationship with parents, because that was a hallmark of your teaching career. But we'll move on to another school in just a second. So after Welch Junior High, teaching second grade, what was your next Ames school?
Then Edwards School was built. It was brand new. And there were 2 sections of second grade at Old Welch. And the person that had been there the longest got to choose whether they wanted to remain at Welch or move to Edwards. Well, the other second grade teacher had been in Welch a long time, and she loved the principal, John Harlan. And so she chose to stay. She felt very comfortable staying there. So I was transferred then over to the brand new Edwards School. A huge room, lots of windows, lots of cupboards.
And some place to wash your hands.
And a place to wash your hands when you finger painted, right.
Did you have more children there than you did at...
They tried to keep it around 24, 25, 26. But when I was teacher of the year, I actually had 30 second graders.
That's a lot of energy.
That is a lot of energy.
Tell me just very quickly about what the curriculum was for second graders at that time. The specified curriculum, not what you might have added or enriched, but what was the specified curriculum?
Well, essentially, reading, math, social studies, science. And we taught, at the lower level, we taught our own music and art. Mm-hmm. And a little later, they had special mm-hmm. teachers.
And were the books, the pretty standard ones, used throughout the entire school system?
They were.
And so there weren't a lot of choices there.
Pardon?
There weren't a lot of choices in terms of your...
No, the books were chosen for us.
But you chose to do some things that were enrichment, because I think, if I remember right, you were a Spanish major in college.
I was, an elementary ed and Spanish major. I went in the... one summer, I went out to the University of Colorado and took a 3-week course in how to teach foreign language in the elementary school, but without speaking English, but completely doing the foreign language, which was Spanish for me. Mm-hmm. And so I came back that year and thought that would be fun to teach the kids Spanish. And so I recognized that there would be no continuity. I recognized it was rather unusual, but the thing was the children loved it. At the beginning of the day, we'd sing a song, or at the end of the day, we had a couple minutes to go home. I would do some Spanish with them. I learned to use little burros, little paper burros, different colors with different numbers on one side and the colors. And so that's how they learned their colors and their numbers. Mm-hmm. And they thought it was great. And I said I realized there'd be no continuity, but since then I've heard from parents that their child couldn't wait till they got to high school to take Spanish, or they wanted to take Spanish in college or teach Spanish. And so there was a lot of carryover, even just for that 1 year.
And you might have planted some seeds, maybe not just in Spanish, but helping children understand an international framework.
That's right. That's right.
They might have been able to pronounce something that they saw in the newspaper and previously wouldn't have been able to.
That's right. And we sang Happy Birthday in Spanish, and at that time we could sing Christmas carols in the classroom, and so we sang some Christmas carols in like Silent Night, in Spanish. And so this was an enrichment, and it didn't take much time. It was usually just a few minutes here and there.
So this is a bridge to talking about Teacher of the Year. I believe that Mrs. Irene Swanson is the person who nominated you here in Ames. What did she say about you for the nomination that you think caught the eye of the people who were making the determination of the honor?
I really don't know what she would have said. She compiled a booklet of recommendations and letters from parents that was sent to Iowa. Mm-hmm. And then I was chosen Iowa Teacher of the Year. The National Teacher of the Year was more extensive because a lady from Washington, D.C. came to Ames and spent several days in my classroom and interviewed other teachers and roommates and friends, mm-hmm. principals. And so I think the national teacher was based mostly on what ideas she had, and she went back when she went back to Washington, D.C.
Do you think that the international language focus might have caught their eye?
I think it caught their eye. In fact, when I went to see President Eisenhower, which will come up probably a little later, that was one thing that he did mention was about teaching Spanish, but I think it did catch their eye.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you had a close relationship with parents. And of course, in that time period, there were usually just one person as the single wage earner in the family, and right. left typically the mom, which might have made it a little bit easier. But you did a lot to connect with the parents.
I did, and you're right, because most of the mothers, or I can almost say 100% of the mothers, did not work outside the home. there was a closer relationship with the mothers and with the families, because they would often invite me over for dinner, or for something, a snack after school. So you got to know the whole family, you got to know the home, and this was more possible because the mothers weren't working outside the home.
I know that there have always been ways to communicate with parents. Typically, sometimes there are formal yearly assessments that you include the parents in. You talk to the parents about the child's progress. But you did some other things with parents.
Yeah, I would, twice a year I would have a meeting in the classroom and would tell them what was expected in, I didn't mention spelling before, but what was expected in reading, or what we would be covering this year in reading, math, spelling, and so forth, to help them understand where we were going, where we were headed. And I compiled a booklet called My Second Grade, or My Second Grader, or something, and the child, the pupil, would color the outside of it, and then inside would have a lot of information that the parents could take home. And that was a little bit unusual to be doing that too.
But when one thinks about how children learn, they don't just learn for the hours that they're sitting in front of a teacher. They're learning all the time. So engaging the parents in that process was a smart thing to do.
That's right. That's right.
So the parents would know what the expectation was.
That's right.
Now, as a teacher, in addition to the instruction, you had playground duty and you had time being outside. And the reason that I mention this is I saw a lovely picture of you in a skirt and heels and snow in the playground.
Yes, we went out on the playground, and we had certain assignments. And you're right, that picture kind of is interesting that I was out in the snow with heels. But we wore skirts at that time. We didn't wear pants or jeans to teach in.
Well, I'm digressing. I'm sorry. We were talking about the National Teacher of Year.
Okay.
So it was in 1958 that the woman came to Ames to assess your teaching style. And then how did you find out that you had received the honor?
Actually, they called my principal, and he came down to my room and told me. And that was on the night of PTA at school. So things let loose.
There was
that
a lot of
night.
joy.
It was a lot of joy, but from then on it was just constant telephone calls, reporters and photographers coming into the classroom and spending several hours writing stories and taking pictures, interviewing the children. It was exciting, but
You were a celebrity.
yeah, but it was kind of disrupted things, but the children were very good. They didn't seem to let it bother them too much to have all these people in the room.
It was probably an educational opportunity for them.
That's
Did
right.
you kind of seize on that?
That's right.
And talk about, well, this is a reporter from Cedar Rapids who's near my hometown. And
Yeah, there were from all over, Des Moines, Cedar Rapids,
I could-
Associated Press, United Press.
even though they were second graders, I could almost picture you putting up a map and putting a pin where everybody came from.
Where they were, I didn't do that. It sounds like a good idea.
I've seen your scrapbook, and there was coast to coast media coverage of this.
That's
So
right.
you probably got calls from California?
I did. I received hundreds of letters. Some of them were congratulatory from people I knew. Some were congratulatory from people I did not know. Many included a clipping from their town, so I have clippings from all over the United States. I received letters from people who had children that had some sort of a problem that they would like to have me help them with. I received invitations for dates. There was one in particular that didn't like President Eisenhower, so they had to tell me about that because I had gone to see him. Just a variety of letters, but hundreds of letters.
Once your principal told you about this honor, and there was lots of media attention, of course you got to be honored in two major cities in the United States, Washington, D.C. and New York. And this is made possible by some sponsors. There were big periodicals at the time, I think, that were sponsoring this.
Yes, the financial sponsorship was from McCall's Magazine, and they were one that came and spent a lot of time in the classroom, and then they had the story in their magazine. It was actually sponsored by the Department of Education in Washington D.C. and what's called the Department of I forget the name, but it includes all the heads of education in all the states. They have a blanket name for all of those. So that was who actually sponsored it and started it. But financially, all my trip to Washington, D.C. and New York and everything was paid by McCall's Magazine.
I know you've been to the White House other times than your first time, but it must have been an honor, and you must have kind of been pretty excited.
It was exciting. It was exciting.
I mean, I think you got to go to the Oval Office. Yes.
Got to go to the Oval Office. When we first went in, of course, we had to go through all the checking and everything, but when we first went in, we were in an outer room, and it had risers in it. And so we were waiting in there, and then all of a sudden the door opened, and the photographers and the reporters dashed in, pushed in, and got on the risers. And then the door opened, and President Eisenhower came into that outer room, and we talked a little bit there. And then he said, "Come into my place." And we went into the Oval Office. And that's when we actually talked one-on-one.
And of course, you're an Iowan. His wife was born in Boone, Iowa. I'm sure that might have been a conversation thread.
That was one thing we talked about. His wife also lived in Cedar Rapids when she was little, and he called that one of the nicest and cleanest cities that he knew. He talked about the Spanish. He talked about a cook that he had had in the service that he encouraged to go to college and become a teacher. And he talked about his grandchildren. He wanted to know if my students would enjoy having a letter from him.
A smart man.
And I said they would. So he did send, later when we got back, he did send a letter to the children, to the whole classroom. And then they wrote letters back to him and sent pictures. Someone came to our classroom and took pictures of each child to go in the letter. Those
children must be just very memorable for you. I know a teacher treasures all children, but that is quite a year. And
yes, and I remember most of my second graders pretty well, but I do remember them. And when I see them, my name now is Humphrey, but when I see them, they'll be here visiting, or some of them still live here. They want to call me Miss Listebarger, and even though they know that I'm Mrs. Humphrey now.
I'm so glad you did that. You said your name, because I should have included that in the introduction, because if someone goes back to 1958, it won't say
That's
Humphrey.
right.
It'll say
before I was married in 1959.
Right.
So this was in 1958.
Your time in Washington, D.C., three days, was it?
I think it was 3 days in Washington, D.C. and about 3 days in New York.
And so from Washington, D.C., you went to New York. And
That's right.
You met some dignitaries there?
And in Washington, D.C., I had several receptions, the Department of Education, and several receptions, went to a stage play, ate out a lot of special places, lived in a really nice 3-room suite. And they did take me to the Capitol, where I met any congressman who had been in education at any time. Even some of them had only taught for a year or so, but they didn't. So I have a lot of neat pictures of Lyndon Johnson and Jack Kennedy and
probably Bobby Kennedy as well.
And Bobby Kennedy. So
on the 50th anniversary of your being Teacher of the Year, I think you returned to Washington, D.C.
It was the 50th anniversary of the beginning of
Teacher of the Year.
The Teacher of the Year began in 1952, so it was only in its 7th year, and has made a lot of changes since, but it was only in its 7th year. And so, yes, in the 50th anniversary, they invited all the National Teachers of the Year to come with all expense paid to Washington, D.C. And then we were in the Rose Garden when the new Teacher of the Year was honored by the president.
I can almost eavesdrop in my mind listening to the really literate and fun conversations the teachers of the year must have had.
It's fun to meet them.
All
Yeah.
energetic, all educated, all forward-thinking people.
Yeah. And dedicated.
Yes,
Right.
very much so, because I don't think one gets that honor without meeting some of those criteria. I hope that's my assessment. Tell me a little bit about when you left teaching. Was that hard for you to leave teaching then in Ames?
It was the first day of school when I didn't go back. You know, my husband kids me and said that I was sitting in the window weeping, but that isn't quite accurate. But anyhow, it was hard. But at that time, you could not be pregnant and teach, and we wanted to have a family. So I did quit teaching, and I have used my teaching skills in so many ways since then that I don't feel that, you know, they were wasted. Just in so many committees and in helping in school and PTA and raising our own children, and so I feel that I've used my teaching skills in a lot of ways.
There are some people that say that teachers are born, not made, so maybe there's just some of that DNA in you that knows how to organize, knows how to break things into small bits, and keep the attention span going. Those
And
are
you
all.
said born and not made. You, I always wanted to be a teacher. Never wanted to be anything else. And from the time I was little, I would always gather children around me, and the last day of school I would take all my things home, and the first thing we'd do was play school. But I just always wanted to be a teacher, never anything else.
Well, the honor was well bestowed. Congratulations many years later.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for talking with me. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome, Teresa.